Welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. As this conflict in the Middle East continues to spiral, the President Donald Trump says the United States and their military has the capability to go even further beyond that 4 to 5 week time frame. The United States and Central Command saying they have struck some 1,200 plus targets so far. These are some of the images we're getting in from Central Command as the U.S. and Israel have continued to pound Iran since killing its supreme leader, the Ayatollah, on Saturday. Tehran and its allies have hit back against Israel, neighboring Gulf states, and targets critical to the world's production of oil and natural gas. The intensity of the attacks and the lack of apparent exit plan set the stage for a prolonged conflict with far-reaching consequences. Let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox and bring into the conversation the director of the Missile Defense Project for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Tom Karako. Tom, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And obviously, 48 hours into this, there are so many areas, targets that have been struck by the United States. What are you keeping your eye on? What has stood out so far?
Yeah, well, look, a couple things. There's been, as I said, over 1,000 targets hit within the first 24 hours. That's pretty remarkable. That was a function of the amount of spring-loaded force that had been put into the area, and of course a combination of U.S. and Israel working together. So far, U.S. and Israel. Perhaps some other folks will get involved. But a handful of things. Look, there's been a couple hundred ballistic missiles fired by Iran, and I think well over 1,000 drones fired at the United States, at Israel, and at lots of other countries in the region. So a couple things. One, a lot of those things have been intercepted by our air and missile defenses. Not everything has been. Nevertheless, it's actually pretty remarkable the sheer number that has been. That things will get through. Defenses are finite. Defenses cannot be everywhere all the time, but it's nevertheless remarkable that they have been so effective. Nevertheless, they're also finite in terms of number. And here's the big worry, is that as this continues to go on, as Iran continues to fire more of these things, if we do not destroy them on the ground, frankly, our missile defenses could potentially be depleted.
Yeah, and I want to ask you that, how critical is it? Because if this goes on 4 or 5 weeks, a prolonged in nature, President Trump said they had the capability to go further, but how much further?
Well, how much time you try to buy yourself is going to depend upon a number of variables. Number one, how many threats, how many missiles that they are able to launch and get off. That is largely contingent upon the command and control structure within Iran, but also a function of how much we and the Israelis are not able to destroy on the ground. Frankly, destroying things on the ground before they can get launched is one of the most urgent things to be done. And so it also is a function of where they attack, right? They could be launching missiles at places where there are no defenses, and there's plenty of places like that, in which case it's less of a anything you can control, for instance. And so there's all kinds of factors and variables that affect how long it can go on. Of course, it can go on even in the absence of defenses, in which case those threats simply land.
And I want to ask you, because the amount of assets, the stockpile the United States has had, we know from Central Command, they posting this on social media, talking about this Operation Epic Fury, but also the assets that were used, B-1, B-2 bombers, talking about the fighter jets, F-16, F-22, stealth fighters. In terms of this, is this the typical assets that you might expect involved in this? Does anything on this list stand out to you?
Well, look, there's nothing quite typical about the scope of this operation. I'll say that, look, there's a handful of things on there. There's Tomahawk missiles. It's going to be very interesting how many we end up firing. There's Patriot and THAAD and Aegis missile defenses on that list. The fact that you have B-1 and B-2 bombers, right, those are really scarce strategic assets, and the fact that they have been marshaled and then sent half a world away, that's a pretty strong testament to the scope and the quantity of commitment that's going on here. So that's a big deal. That doesn't happen just all the time. I will say, I've mentioned the Tomahawks and perhaps other long-range strike missiles that we have. That's something I'm going to be watching closely, is just how many they end up saying that we are expending. The reason is that these are scarce assets as well, and we need lots of those things to deter Chinese adventurism. And so if you're Russia and you're China, you are looking at all the various offensive and defensive missiles that the United States is firing here. And frankly, you're kind of salivating. You're happy to see those being expended, because then we don't have them to deter their mischief.
And deterrence is so very critical to all of these in different arenas around the globe. I do want to ask you about some of the assets involved right now, because potentially drones used. We talk about the possibility of boots on the ground where they're keeping their distance. The United States is for the time being. They used one-way drones potentially for the first time. What do you make of that? How important might that be to the United States?
I think it's actually a very good experiment, right? The quantity of this new class of drones that was apparently ginned up and frankly reverse engineered from some of the Iranian Shaheds that they have been shooting at their neighbors, and also that they have been selling to Russia to use in Ukraine. So the reports are that this was basically reverse engineered and sending it back, return to sender sort of a thing, and doing so apparently more cheaply than the Iranians did so themselves. That's a good experiment in defense acquisition. And also a bit of poetic justice. But I will also say that it is the desire for low-cost munitions like that, low-cost drones. You're just going to see a whole lot more of that.
Are we seeing the United States military go more in that? Because you mentioned the Tomahawks, which are so very valuable, but also cost so much to use in that way. Are we seeing the United States military go in that direction?
So this is sort of the perennial pull and push, that there's all this talk and all this rhetoric about affordable mass and very cheap munitions and cheap drones and the like. But the thing is, you have to get them around the world. You have to get them halfway across the world to be able to use those sort of things. So you go back to that list that you had up a second ago. There's a lot of extremely expensive platforms, both maritime and aerial platforms, that are not, we always say we want a high-low mix. Well, there's a lot of high in that high-low mix that's being used so far. And in part, that's because we want to be able to do this with an absolute minimum of casualties. And so far, there have been some casualties, sadly, but in the scheme of things, a relatively small number. So it's going to be a mix of the high and the low. For right now, it's actually still pretty high emphasis on the high-end capabilities and high-end platforms.
All right, obviously we talk a lot about the successes so far in this Operation Epic Fury, and obviously there are some holes, some gapes in there. And I want to put this up because obviously an unfortunate nature earlier on today, what happened in Kuwait, as the Washington Post on social media saying 3 American F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jets crashed Monday morning over Kuwait, an apparent friendly fire incident. The U.S. Central Command said in a statement all 6 crew members ejected safely and are in stable condition. But when you hear 3 American fighter jets going down, it makes your heart stop. Can you speak to that? How unusual might that be? And is this just kind of part of what we're going on in that region?
Yeah, a couple things. One, there's all kinds of questions. Everyone wants to know, look, was their friend or foe indicator turned on? Was there some sort of lack of communication? I think we're not going to know that for just a bit. I think it could very well turn out to be some sort of operational fluke or some kind of user error on the part of our Kuwaiti friends. Well, we'll see. We don't know, but we'll see. It is, of course, gratifying that the pilots are all okay. That's very good news. But I'll also just make the following observation, that while this is not the sort of thing that is good and not the sort of thing that you want to make light of, the Kuwaitis operate the Patriot missile defense system, air missile defense system. And you know what? It works. It works whenever you point at something in the air and try to bring it down. That is true of the 18 countries that operate Patriot, including Ukraine, for instance. But you know what the air defense systems that don't work? The ones in Iran. The Russian-made air defense systems that were suppressed very quickly in this conflict.
Are there any other lessons to learn from that? Because you don't want to lose those assets. Thankfully, those 6 U.S. service members, they were able to get out of this bad situation. Are there any other lessons to take from this to avoid this in the future? Because you don't want to expend things and assets you don't have.
Oh, absolutely. And the short answer is almost certainly going to be some mix of lots more training, making sure that all of our partners and allies have the training to operate the Patriot system in the way that it needs to be. There's always a desire for more interoperability and communication, but at the same time, there is always that prospect of uncertainty and that prospect of mistakes being made in a very high tension environment. And I think it's also important not to overlearn the lessons here, that mistakes sometimes happen, and it is kind of in the nature of things that will happen.
Yeah, we talk about sometimes the fog of war kind of about this, and maybe that is what unfortunately happened in that situation. And not only what is used in this conflict, but where they are using it. I want to put this up here as well. Jennifer Griffin says the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh empty at the time of Iranian drone strike, saying no injuries. But in terms of what the United States is targeting, talking about ballistic missiles, nuclear capabilities, is there anything in your mind of what we're seeing in terms of those targets, over 1,000 already being struck right now, that signals a strategy from the United States?
Right. Well, I think the reports and the statements by administration officials, Secretary Rubio, for instance, this evening, look, first they went in and suppressed the air defenses. Got to get that done so that you can do everything else. Now they say they've established air supremacy. That's good. That means that you can drop gravity bombs with impunity, and you don't have to have that standoff capability. That reduces the risk to pilots to do their jobs. And then obviously they're trying to hit the nuclear facilities, but it's really the ballistic missile apparatus. And actually, that was the really interesting part of what Secretary Rubio said that was pretty blunt, is the production rates of missiles that have like 100 a month or something like that, and of various drones that is just needed to be stemmed, fundamentally needed to be stemmed. And I think that's kind of the urgent reality here that hasn't really quite been emphasized enough, is time was not on our side. That time seemingly was on the side of the Iranians. Last summer, over the course of a long weekend, they fired hundreds and hundreds of missiles at Israel and the United States, and we had to expend many, many missile defense interceptors just to play catch temporarily, as it were, for those things. That is an unsustainable situation. And so I think what you're seeing here is we've kind of had enough. We're not going to take it anymore. And Israel can't afford to continue to do this. We can't afford to continue this. So frankly, I think we're kind of backed into the need to take this offensive operation to, no kidding, dismantle and fundamentally degrade their missile capability so they just stop doing this.
Yeah, and I want to get to that because that's an interesting point. Marco Rubio said this is why it happened now, not in a year's time. If this had happened in a year's time, would Iran be more able to sustain a longer conflict?
Well, I think it's a function of if they keep firing the missiles and we and our partners and our allies in the region run out of the means to stop them. And that's, I think, just the numbers game that seemed to be going on. And so that's why time wasn't on our side.
All right, my last question before I let you go, because this is 48 hours in, we could be seeing weeks of this. That's what President Trump is saying they have the capability to do it with the U.S. military might. What signals are you looking at? What other interesting facets are you looking at for maybe this going in the right direction for the base case scenario? What notes might be out there that you're keeping your eye on?
Yeah, I think it's going to be real important just how much the situation on the ground, because it's going to be very hard to do this, everything from the air. It's really hard to believe that there wouldn't need to be at least special forces doing things, for no other reason than to inspect and to try to get a sense of, hey, when we bomb a missile, an underground missile city, an underground missile tunnels, like was it successful, do we think? So we're going to have that confidence that this is working. And then in terms of other things to be watching, I think it's fundamentally comes down to seeing the job through. Last summer, frankly, it was sort of throwing the Iranian regime a lifeline to say, hey, peace, let's stop doing this. I don't think we can be throwing them a lifeline, and of course, that is a foregone conclusion for some Iranian leaders now. But no kidding, it needs to be seen through. If the argument that's been laid out is that this program has to be completely degraded and gotten rid of, then let's make sure that that gets done before we stop, because it's not going to get easier in the future.
That is very true, and obviously U.S. intelligence was so very critical to the initial strike to cut off that head of the snake with the Ayatollah, that obviously the after action, what's going on, to learn from it as well, is very important. All right, Tom, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight here on Live Now.